Hi, thanks for joining me today. I'm going to be giving a talk about carrier screening and how it's been developing over recent years. Please, if you can, refer to this disclaimer relevant to this particular lecture. So, during the course of the lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about mutation screening, about why we would want to screen for mutations in the population, how that might be advantageous, who we should consider screening, and how the information that this kind of screening provides could be useful in general, but also especially in the context of assisted reproductive treatments. And there's more than 6,000 individual disorders that are caused by the inheritance of a defective gene. Now, individually, these are usually relatively rare in most populations, but together, the sum total of all of these disorders in the population can represent a significant disease burden, as we will see. If you were to sequence the genome of any individual in the population, you will probably find, on average, about 15 mutations that are deleterious, and yet those individuals may not have any symptoms of the disease. And this is because most of these mutations are recessive in nature. In other words, you need a defective copy of that gene inherited from both parents in order to manifest the symptoms, whereas most people who have such mutation only have it affecting one gene, one copy of the gene, and are therefore not affected themselves. However, of course, if they end up having children with someone else who also has a mutation in the same gene, there's a possibility, a 1 in 4 chance, that any children they produce will inherit a defective copy from both of the parents and therefore express the particular disorder. So most people are unaware that they carry mutations. They usually have no history of the actual condition. And as we've discussed already, no symptoms of the disease due to their recessive nature. But despite this, about 1 in 300 births are actually affected by an inherited condition. And these cause a disproportionate number of neonatal deaths, about 1 in 5 neonatal deaths being caused by the presence of a genetic disorder. 80% of parents who have an affected child born did not know that they were carriers. And so for them, their diagnosis as being a carrier is the birth of their affected child. So, of course, if we can detect couples who are at risk of having affected children before they start their families, it gives the opportunity to provide them with appropriate counseling and allow them to make informed choices about their reproductive options. Now, sometimes when I tell people that we're all carrying mutations, that parents who have affected children don't usually know that they were carriers prior to the child's birth, sometimes people are a little bit surprised by that. They think, well, surely there must have been some kind of clue that they were a carrier. Either they must have had some symptoms themselves, or maybe they had a cousin or another relative who actually had the disease. Well, we can think about how likely that is just with this slide here. Here we have a family who knows for sure that they are carriers of a disorder. This couple at the top here, they know that they are carriers of this inherited condition because they have an affected child here. So I guess the question is, in a family such as this, how long would it be before this condition appeared again? Let's make it as likely as possible. Let's say that this family have 2 or 3 kids each generation, as is pretty typical these days. And let's say they are carrying cystic fibrosis. Now, this is the most common inherited condition where I'm sitting currently in the United Kingdom, and that's true for most of Western Europe, and also, of course, has very high prevalence in the United States, North America. So if we have a carrier frequency of 1 in 25, it means anyone marrying into the family has a 1 in 25 chance of having the mutation. So let's see how long it takes, on average, before this condition would occur in the family again. Well, it turns out that on average, you'd have to get all the way down to the bottom here before you would have another at-risk couple. And if you look carefully, this individual's mutation here, this female's, has been inherited all the way down from this individual in the very first generation of children at the top of the tree. It's been hidden for all of those years because by chance, no one marrying into the family there actually had the mutation. And so it's been completely concealed for all that time. It's probably the distance of about 175 years. Now, this particular individual who now is at risk of having an affected child, you can ask the question of, do they not know that they're a carrier of this very common genetic disorder? Well, the last person in her family to be affected was her great-great-great-great-great-granduncle. And of course, none of us really know the genetic health of such distant relatives. And so even with the most common disorders, such as cystic fibrosis, you can see that they can remain hidden in families for generations, only to suddenly re-emerge unexpectedly. Of course, rarer conditions can remain hidden in families for thousands or even tens of thousands of years before just suddenly re-emerging. They were there all the time, but you just had to wait for this unusual combination of parents who both carriers in order to create the problem. In fact, in this family, this couple who are at risk at the bottom right of the slide, they still might not have an affected child. They only have a 1 in 4 chance for each child they produce. And so this disease may remain hidden in the family for even more generations to come. So we can identify at-risk couples by, of course, looking at family history, and maybe, if you're lucky, there may be an affected family member that alerts you that this couple may be at risk, allowing you to then look at their genetics and see whether they also carry mutations. The couple may have had an affected child, and that's, of course, conclusive evidence that the couple must both be carriers. Of course, what we'd really like is to be able to have a reliable way of identifying at-risk couples that don't rely on a rather sort of tenuous family history that's probably not going to tell us anything very useful and doesn't need them to have already experienced the birth of an affected child. And so these are based, of course, on genetic screening. Now, this has really all begun with the very sort of refined targeted screening. In other words, you're not sequencing the entire genome. That would be prohibitively expensive to use on a whole population of people. But you could look maybe at the most risky genes, the genes that have high prevalence of mutation. And so this has initially been applied to high-risk populations, groups of people within the general population who are known to have particularly high frequencies of individual mutations that can then be screened. Sometimes screening of this kind involves just looking at a mutation or just at one gene. It's usually based on ethnic background, because certain ethnicities have a higher instance of these kinds of mutations. So you can think of Ashkenazi Jewish mutations, thalassemia in Mediterraneans, sickle cell disease for people of African ancestry. In the past, just looking at one gene in a person could have cost as much as $1,000. But as we'll see, the price of doing these sorts of tests have dropped dramatically, and that has allowed us to look in a much broader fashion. So this whole concept, the concept of preconception screening, is nothing new. It's been around since at least the 1970s. We've seen this with looking at Tay-Sachs disease in Ashkenazi Jewish populations. And I think a very good paradigm for this is the situation in Cyprus, where as many as 1 person in 7 is a carrier of beta thalassemia, another recessive condition. They began a screening program back in the early 70s and allowing them to detect at-risk couples and give them appropriate genetic counseling counselling about their reproductive options. And this helped them reduce the number of affected births from 51 in 1974, a seven-fold reduction essentially in the space of about 5 years, all the way down to just 8 births in 1979. There was a further decrease after that screening program became mandatory in the 1980s. And finally, they were only having 5 affected births in a 10-year stretch between 1991 and 2001. After that, they actually had no affected births for the next 5 years. So you can see that this kind of approach can have a huge impact, at least within certain populations, in terms of reducing the disease burden. But remember, this is just looking at one gene in one particular population where there's a known unusually high risk of a condition. However, if we look at the whole general population, some disorders actually have relatively low prevalence within our general population, but maybe of increased risk in specific groups. So if we want to develop a really equitable test, it seems more appropriate to be able to create a screen that's going to be useful for everyone in the population, rather than picking out individual subgroups thereof. This is particularly important because the populations we live in are increasingly intermingled and multi-ethnic. And so you can take the example of Cyprus, where back in the 70s, that particular screen for beta thalassemia would have been useful across the whole population. But now with more and more mixing, we need to have things which are the screening programs that are able to look at multiple different genes that will be useful for different groups. The other thing is, you might ask someone about their genetic ancestry in order to choose which genes you should look at. But this is notoriously unreliable, and it's been found and shown increasingly that self-reported ancestry is very often incorrect. And that's partly just because we might have family legends but not really know for certain our ancestral backgrounds, but also because, of course, again, our populations are getting more and more genetically mixed. And so often we may be a mix of different ancestries, and we don't necessarily know how much each one of those has actually contributed to our final genetics. So what you really want to aim for is what's termed pan-ethnic carrier screening, something that's not specific to an individual ethnicity. Again, this began by looking at individual genes like cystic fibrosis gene, CFTR, and also looking for the condition of spinal muscular atrophy. These are caused by individual genes, but a kind of value across all ethnicities. Although there are certain groups that might have a higher prevalence of things like cystic fibrosis, you can find them at appreciable frequencies in most global populations. So individual genes like these started to be screened in some countries across the whole population, particularly if a woman became pregnant, for example, that might trigger a screening event. However, with the falling costs of things like next generation sequencing, it's become possible now to look at hundreds of genes if we want to, for the same kind of cost that it used to be for looking at just one. And so this has really opened up the possibility of having a truly pan-ethnic screen where you cover mutations, genes, which are problematic in multiple individual groups or ethnicities, and allow that to be screened across the whole population, allowing us to pick up people with uncertain ancestry that might have these kinds of risks, and also make a test that's going to be useful for everybody. The proportion of couples who will actually be detected and shown to be at risk is going to vary according to the content of the test. Of course, you can imagine if you look at just one gene, you're only going to find a few people, a few couples who are at risk. If you look at every gene, you're going to find a whole lot more. The actual content of individual pan-ethnic carrier screening tests that are available today actually varies quite a bit. but typically they detect between about 2% and 5% of all couples screened to be at risk. In other words, between about 1 in 50 and 1 in 20 couples carry a recessive mutation that both of them have. So what are the benefits of this kind of carrier screening? Well, we've talked about some of the obvious ones. It allows us to test for multiple recessive inherited conditions using a single blood sample or even saliva sample. The cost, now that we have next generation sequencing, is lower than the historic costs were for testing individual genes, which is, a remarkable situation to be in now. And it speaks to the wonderful innovations that there have been within genetics to allow us to get to this point. We're going to certainly be able, by looking at more genes, to identify more high-risk couples, including some which would have previously kind of passed under the radar and then maybe had some adverse outcomes as a result. Having all of this genetic information will allow us to have much better patient counseling, allow them to make informed decisions about their reproductive choices. So it's going to really support that whole reproductive autonomy and decision-making. There are some difficulties, though. One of the difficulties is that there are multiple different carrier screening methodologies out there, and they don't perfectly overlap. So that can lead to some confusion for patients, especially if one partner has been screened using one platform and their other partner has been screened using a different one. They may get slightly different information. Some carrier screening panels have included genes that are not only recessive. They've included genes where if you detect a mutation, it may actually have some relevance to the health of that individual. So that can be problematic. Really, the purpose of these carrier screenings is about reproductive risk. It's about allowing the couple to know whether they have an elevated risk of having an affected child. The purpose isn't really to tell them about their own future health. And of course, that can lead to various problems with counseling for patients if you do suddenly detect that kind of information. We're certainly going to find that there's more need for genetic counseling just simply because we're detecting a greater number of patients who carry these mutations. There is also the possibility that patients come away with a false reassurance that everything has been tested, and that if we haven't detected that they and their partner have a mutation in the same gene, that they are at zero risk. And this certainly is not the case. Carrier screening is about understanding the risk, but it's not about guaranteeing no risk. And we'll see a bit more about that later in the talk. So what should actually be tested? Well, various professional societies about 6 years ago came out with a position statement. They suggested that the only disorders included in a carrier screening panel should be those which are severe and impactful. They're the kind where you would think about doing prenatal diagnosis if a couple was at risk of having an affected pregnancy. Disorders that have an adult onset, late onset disorders, or ones where the phenotype was not perfectly linked to the mutations should be excluded. So there should be a very good association of the mutation that you're detecting with a known outcome, a known phenotype that it produces. There shouldn't be a question about that. There should be knowledge about mutation rates within the population. How common are those mutations? And that's important for allowing you to calculate the residual risk. And I'll explain exactly what that means shortly. Certainly the limitations of the test should be clearly indicated, and it's important the patient understands that they're not being tested for everything. So as a result of these kinds of guidelines, carrier screening today typically focuses on genes that have a recessive mode of inheritance, as we've already discussed. So the detection of a mutation in an individual patient doesn't mean that they will have the disease themselves. X-linked diseases are frequently screened in women as well. Of course, they behave mostly in a recessive manner for them. The recommendations of the American colleges are followed. We're looking at genes that have where a mutation causes a significant impact on life expectancy or quality of life and have a pretty high appreciable carrier rate in the general population. And we're talking about typically genes with a mutation frequency of at least one person in 200 carrying the mutation. Carrier screening is typically not looking at autosomal dominant mutations, ones that would definitely or with high likelihood have an impact on the actual individual themselves if they carried the mutation. They try to avoid looking at multifactorial conditions. Polygenic disorders are often not looked at. So ones that are caused by multiple conditions acting in concert in order to give you the phenotype. As I mentioned, adult onset disorders typically aren't tested, nor are those of low penetrance. That means a disorder where you have the mutations that should cause the disorder, but there's no guarantee that you'll develop the disease. It's just an increased risk of disease. Those are typically excluded as well. And as are mutations that are associated with a relatively minor impact on health, or ones where they cause a health problem, but it's one that's readily treatable. I should certainly draw your attention to the very most recent recommendations, especially because they just came out this year. And you may be interested to take a look at this particular paper because this one gives a really nice summary of where carrier screening has come from and where it is today with some very useful recommendations. So I would certainly draw your attention to that. So a couple of things about carrier screening concepts, and these are just important, especially if you're talking with patients, to understand about the power of carrier screening and what it's giving, and also maybe what it's not delivering. So an important aspect of this, of course, is the detection rate. What percentage of true carriers that exist in the population will actually be detected? This might be ethnicity dependent. For example, if you're looking at cystic fibrosis, you might choose to look at the top 20 mutations within that particular gene. But that top 20 may be very appropriate for people, say, of Western European descent, but far less so if you're talking about people within the population from another part of the world ancestrally. So this is an important concept to consider. Certainly, if you sequence the full gene, you're going to get a more complete picture than if you just pick out individual mutations to look at. And that, as we will see in a few slides' time, has become more of a realistic possibility to do. Another concept is that of residual risk. In other words, if a patient has a negative result, you say they don't have a mutation in a particular gene, what is the chance that actually they are a carrier and you just missed the mutation that they're carrying? So this is residual risk. It's calculated based on the detection rate of your particular test and the incidence of the mutations you're looking at in the patient's ethnic group. Then finally, we have reproductive risk. So this is the possibility that a screened couple will still have an affected child, even though you thought that they were not at elevated risk. So for a recessive condition, such as those that we would normally look at during carrier screening, it's the chance that the male patient is a carrier multiplied by the probability that the female partner is a carrier times the chance of having an affected child if you're carrying a recessive disorder, which is 1 in 4. So let's just do a quick worked example of that. Let's take cystic fibrosis again as an example. Where I'm sitting here, the carrier frequency is about 1 in 25, so 0.04. So say we have a test that is pretty good. It detects about 95% of all mutations that are out there in the general population. So the probability of missing a mutation is 0.05. So what's the probability that our individual actually is a carrier, even though we haven't detected a mutation? Well, it's the chance that they are a carrier, 1 in 25, that's the population carrier rate, times the chance that we miss the mutation equals 0.002. In other words, a residual risk of 1 in 500. If we've said that they're unaffected, their chance of actually being if we've said they're not a carrier, their chance of being a carrier is 1 in 500 in this particular example. It's a recessive condition, so only 1 in 4 children would be affected. So if we've detected that their partner is definitely a carrier, the risk for this couple, in other words, the residual reproductive risk, is 0.002. That's the chance that she is a carrier and we've not managed to detect it, multiplied by that 1 in 4 chance that they would have an affected child anyway. So it comes out as about 1 in 2,000 risk. So again, this emphasizes that carrier screening allows us to reduce the risk, but it certainly doesn't altogether eliminate it. And there's no carrier screening technology available today that can guarantee to detect every single mutation in every single gene, although some certainly get very close. So initial strategies that we've had for carrier screening technology targeted common mutations in single genes. So they were usually using things like the polymerase chain reaction to amplify specific pieces of gene where common mutations were known to exist. So here's an example of a gene. You can see its different functional bits like the promoter and a few exons which contain the coding sequence of that gene. And maybe if we looked in the population, we would find that there are several mutations that exist in this gene. And the longer the red bar here, the more common they are. So early methodologies would have looked at this gene and might have just targeted the most common mutations. And of course, that's very valuable. You're going to pick up a good proportion of people who carry mutations in the gene that way. But later approaches allowed us to look at many, many more mutations, things like microarray analysis, for example, could allow us to detect thousands of mutations in one go. And so you might pick up even more mutations within the gene, covering almost everything. But as you see, there are still a few very rare mutations. In fact, some of these mutations might be completely unknown to science because they may only reside in one family, for example. And so you can't design necessarily targeted approaches that will detect mutations that you're not even aware exist. So nowadays, the main approach used is a kind of next generation sequencing methodology where you would attempt to cover all the functional areas of a gene. And you can do this in a kind of massive targeted PCR approach, or people use approaches like exome sequencing as well in order to capture different parts of genes and look at them in a more comprehensive way like this. And this allows you, of course, to also detect novel mutations, ones that are not currently catalogued anywhere. So this kind of approach, you typically cover the coding regions of genes, you'd cover important control regions of genes, the boundaries between exons and introns that can sometimes be spliced incorrectly. It will allow us to detect those rare mutations and novel mutations. Even this, though, may still miss some mutations that are of relevance, ones that may be distant from the gene and yet affect the way that it's expressed, for example, things like enhancer regions. And you may sometimes miss large deletions of the gene too. If we think about the actual application of these methods, particularly in the context of IVF treatments, of course, it may make a lot of sense to use these sorts of methods there. And this has been done in the past. And here's some older data just from one commercial carrier screening that looked at about 190 high impact genes in both partners. Many tests look at quite a lot more than this now. About a third of the patients in this particular assay were found to be carriers of a high impact disorder. 2% of couples with this screen were carriers of mutations in the same gene. Interestingly, more than 40% of these couples, after counseling, opted for pre-implantation genetic testing. So again, it's showing you that those patients who might consider assisted reproductive treatment or might need assisted reproductive treatment after counseling may be quite often going to move on to approaches like PGT to help them to avoid an affected pregnancy. Of course, other options like prenatal testing are likely to be available to them as well, and that may suit some patients better. But particularly if they are IVF patients, it probably makes very good sense that the selection should happen at the prior to embryo transfer. You know, for a couple that are maybe struggling to achieve a pregnancy, the whole idea that they would get pregnant and then maybe have to consider a pregnancy termination due to a severe inherited condition is obviously an extremely difficult thing. So PGT, obviously, for couples undergoing IVF and having this kind of screening makes, I think, very good sense. Out of those patients in this particular study that went on to pre-implantation genetic testing, half of them did produce at least one affected embryo. So again, showing that had they not had the screening, probably about half of these patients would have been at risk at least of producing an affected pregnancy. So again, showing the real value of this kind of approach. So who is this expanded carrier screening for? Well, really it's for any couple planning to start a family. And of course, we include IVF patients in that group, but really even fertile couples, it's a benefit to have this information, I believe. For IVF patients, of course, in a way, you don't have a more planned pregnancy than an IVF pregnancy. And it's a very precious pregnancy because it's often long fought for by the patients. And so you really don't want anything to go wrong with that. And so I think it's not surprising that many fertility clinics are starting to apply or offer expanded carrier screening as a matter almost of routine to their patients. The other area we see it used a lot in assisted reproductive technologies is in gamete donors. And the whole idea being that, again, when you're providing a gamete donor, you want that cycle to be a success. You want to deliver to your patients a healthy baby at the end of it. And so one of the things that we can do in choosing gamete donors is to choose those who do not have recessive mutations in the same genes as our patients. Of course, the gamete donors are going to have recessive mutations very often, just like our patients do, just like we do. And that's okay because they're recessive. They're not going to cause a problem. The problem only comes when you match a gamete donor and a patient who have a recessive mutation in the same gene. And that's something that can be avoided when you're using carrier screening for both of them. And just making sure you don't make matches like that. Again, it's not going to reduce the risk to zero, but it will dramatically limit the probability of an inherited condition being present in the child. So we've seen a growing use of this kind of approach in IVF clinics and in donor banks in particular. So I think that's a trend that's going to continue. I personally wouldn't be surprised if it became just a standard of care over the next few years that all gamete donors and patients who are using them undergo quite a broad carrier screen. Of course, it's quite common already to look at just a smaller number of genes that are considered to pose a risk, but I think that's going to expand. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention. I hope you found the lecture to be useful. I have been passed a couple of questions. So the first is, why is there a shift towards pan-ethnic carrier screening? Well, I think carrier screening in general, following the cost reductions that we've seen in sequencing, has permitted the possibility of looking at a lot of different genes. In the past, pan-ethnic screening was, I think, always a great concept. We always knew that this would provide a more equitable solution for patients, and also give you the possibility of detecting mutations that you wouldn't have guessed were there because of a rather clouded genetic ancestry and uncertainty about the ethnic background of individual patients. So we always knew it was a good concept, but I think the reason that it's really come to the fore now is that now it's a concept we can deliver on. Now with next generation sequencing technology, we can look at a large number of genes that are important for different segments of the population, genes that are important to people who don't know about their specific ethnic ancestry. We can put those all together at an affordable price and deliver a test which is of great value across the entire population. So I think it's really something, the rise of expanded carrier screening, if you want to call that, the rise of pan-ethnic screening, it's probably a better word for it, it has been built on the back of the improved genetic technologies. I've got a second question. Why use this in an IVF setting? Why use why use carrier screening in an IVF setting? Well, I think we've kind of covered that already in as much as it's our mission with working with infertile couples to help them start their families, and we want those to be healthy families. This is why we may often do things like chromosome screening as well. It's partly to streamline the IVF process and transfer viable embryos before any others, but it's also to avoid, of course, miscarriages and aneuploid syndromes. And by extension from that, really, of course, we want to have healthy, viable pregnancies. There's really, I think, nothing more difficult than an IVF patient who's struggled maybe for years to obtain a pregnancy, has gone through that emotional roller coaster, has spent who knows how much money to obtain a pregnancy. If that pregnancy is then found to be suffering from a serious inherited condition, and that patient actually has to think about either the possibility of the birth of a seriously impacted child or the termination of that much desired pregnancy, and that there's nothing more difficult than that. So I think if we can avoid those kinds of situations by providing information early, then I think, of course, that is a huge value to the patient. It's possible to be a bit sort of blasé about this and say, well, it's maybe only 1 in 200 or 1 in 300 births that are a problem. Yes, that's true. The majority of births will not have this difficulty. But for those that do, which is still an appreciable number, but for those that do, it's a life-changing event. And so I think having that information can only be a good thing. Obviously, as I've already mentioned with donor gametes, again, it's a simple thing we can do to radically reduce the risk. And so I think since the technology exists, since it's available to us, it makes perfect sense to use it for this purpose. So anyway, I think I'll just leave it there. But to thank you once again for listening to me today. And if you have any follow-up questions about this, my email's there. I'd be more than happy to try and answer them. Okay, thanks very much.